Imagine an idyllic world. Green grass, the sun is shining and it's always 24 degrees outside. People are happy all the time. Cats and dogs live in harmony and majestic pink unicorns are grazing in local parks. There's no crime, mosquitoes are extinct, bacon grows on trees and the government is subsidizing cotton candy. And it's here that we can experience the most extraordinary achievement of human culture, because here it's illegal to ask a designer to make a logo bigger.
Hi, I am Pavel and welcome to the North of Rapture podcast. This series is all about communication with clients from a designer's perspective. Even though clients come to us for help, sometimes they also come with a predetermined notion of how that help is supposed to look like, and are not susceptible to new or different ideas. Convincing them how to take those ideas on board might be a challenge, but not one that's insurmountable. You know what's an insurmountable challenge? Licking your own elbow. I mean, you can try, but it's just not possible. There's a bit of artistry in selling your ideas and yourself as an expert. I believe it's a combination of good manners, storytelling, patience, and showing your knowledge. Still, sometimes you won't be able to catch any fish even if you're throwing dynamite into the pond. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First and foremost, you won't convince anyone that what you designed makes sense if you don't know why it makes sense in the first place. We often use some common UX patterns or certain visual elements almost on instinct, and while in many cases those are perfectly suited for what we're working on, that slightly subconscious way of working bites us in the ass once it comes to presenting the fruits of our labor. Some things that are obvious to us might not be rational choices to our clients, and you end up with a bunch of questions. Why is this color here? Aren't there too many font sizes on this page? Why does it work on click and not on mouse over? Can you make that logo bigger? That can be frustrating, and then the defensive mechanisms kick in, and not only do we get very nervous very quickly, but we can get belligerent as well, as if the client tries to undermine our position. I'm sure many of you have been there, I certainly have, and I think most of that can be avoided if you make one thing a habit. Every time you make an important decision in your design, ask yourself what motivated that decision. Try to predict what the client might ask about that particular element. Make a mental note, or even a written one. Once that becomes part of your workflow, you'll be going over entire conversations in your head about the design process. I know that sounds a bit crazy, but bear with me. I found that internal dialogue tremendously useful not only when it comes to answering clients' questions, but also when presenting my work. More on that in a second. The goal of this exercise is to make you very conscious of your choices, so that you're able to justify them when pressed. Just make sure that you actually have rational reasons for your ideas that can be explained. Stuff like research, common practices, custom solutions with a proven track record, or even basic common sense are all good. Your sense of style or your mom's hunch, not so much. Now that you have a base, it's time to present your designs. First of all, go with a plan. Make an ordered list of things you want to show and discuss. Many people try to improvise from start to finish, but their presentations end up being poorly paced and often confusing. You need to be really focused and eloquent to pull off a design overview in a coherent way without preparation. I always go everything I want to show and say at least a couple of times. I make notes and I consider what kind of questions the client might have. I'd like to think that my experience would enable me to play it by ear, but the truth is, the very thought of going into a meeting unprepared gives me anxiety. Of course, nothing ever goes as planned. The client might ask you questions you weren't expecting, or will interrupt you in the least appropriate moment. In those instances, I always try to steer the meeting back to the original topic and either give the client a short but always meaningful answer, or if necessary actually telling them we will just come back to the matter they raised. I do it because I find it hard to weave in and out of the topic at hand without breaking my flow completely. And that flow is important to me because I'm trying to, wait for it, tell a story. Now, I imagine you've heard that a million times. Your product needs to tell a story. When presenting your work, make it a story. Or could you make that logo bigger? And you know what? I actually wholeheartedly agree with this, but not once have I heard a good explanation of what that actually means. Because, let's face it, the statement itself is pretty vague. Should we create some sort of narrative to go with the presentation? Let's try. Imagine if Little Red Riding Hood had our social app. Not only would she be able to check where wolves were spotted thanks to that new functionality we were discussing, but she'd also be able to see all the liquor stores that sell that pink Cabernet Grandma loves so much.
What?
Yeah, I don't think that works. How I always understood it and how I employed the concept of storytelling was to structure my presentation like a story, albeit in a simplified fashion. It goes something like this. First, you need a setup, or an exposition if you will. Here you can tell the client what the goal of the design is and how you intended to achieve it. You can mention how it relates to the target audience, or the pain points the client came to you with. Also, if you made any changes to the initial concept, present them now, but only as an overview, and say that you'll expand on them once you get to the relevant parts of the design. For the visual part, try to show the designs in a zoomed out way, preferably in their entirety, so that the client doesn't focus on the details too much. I find this introductory part extremely important to grab the client's attention and provide them with enough context for the presentation. Even if the client knows the context full well, it's still important to reiterate it so that they know you were designing with the right reasons in mind. Once you're done with the introduction, it's time to go over the design itself.
Show me what you got!
Now, my strategy here is to go through the presentation not from a designer's perspective, but the user's perspective, with a bit of designer commentary. I show everything in a logical sequence without jumping from one element to the next. If it's a website or an app, I'll start with the navigation, move to the layout composition, then the details from the top down. If it's a branding project, I'll start with the logo, then go through colors and typography, and end on key visuals and messaging. If it's illustrations, I'll talk about the style composition first, then move to the color scheme and then the details. I think it's a good way of going about it, because you're showing how a user would be exposed to the product. The idea here is to build up what you're talking about, then gradually move to the more specific details about each element. Once you deplete one source of information, move to the next one. And now it's a good time to discuss all the aspects of the design with the client. You don't even have to wait for them to ask questions. You can do it too, especially if you see that the client is confused or doesn't follow. Ask what they think about any of the elements, but not in a way that would indicate you're not sure about it or you're seeking their approval. It's your design. You need to be positive that what you designed is what the client needs. This is the part where all that internal dialogue you had when you were designing comes into play. It helps to make the presentation cohesive and interesting because in a way you've already presented it.
Shut up!
I didn't say anything.
I wasn't talking to you.
Finish up by summarizing your choices and make a note of things that still need to be done. You can also mention things that you think can be improved or any additional challenges the product might still be facing. I find that the clients show more trust toward you and your work if you actually acknowledge the issues. And they live happily ever after. And that leads me to the final point of this episode. I told you about the techniques I use to sell my ideas, but it's not going to do you any good if the client doesn't perceive you as an expert. And how do you convince the client that you are, in fact, an expert? For me, it's down to 3 things. 1. You need to be able to justify your choices by showing they are rooted in knowledge and based on provable data, or at the very least common sense. 2. You need to be able to defend those choices by showing confidence in your designs and being level-headed when those designs are being questioned. Don't be timid when presenting your own stuff, and don't take a defensive stance if the client doesn't immediately pat you on the back. And 3. You need to show that you can be flexible. If your client wants to change something and you don't have a good justification of why that change might be detrimental to the design, Don't cling to your choice like a stubborn child. In the end, I think the trick is to make your clients trust you by not just designing something that looks great, but actually being able to explain why it is great. Now, my examples may have focused on entire projects, but it all works on a smaller scale too. So it's applicable not only for the big meetings, but for the day-to-day interactions with your client as well. It also works in written form, so you have those emails covered. Look, I realize this is a recipe for the best case scenario, and you might encounter some very difficult people that will try to do everything in their power to try to discredit you, because they believe they know better. But your best bet is to make an impression as someone who really knows what the hell they are doing. And if you really can't get through to someone even though you are trying, take my advice and just let it go. Because remember, regardless of how good your reasons, how enormous your charm, and how eloquent you are, there's always going to be that one person who will want that f***ing logo bigger. You are listening to the North of Rapture podcast. This episode was made in association with NetGuru. If you have any comments, questions, or you just want to say hi, you can reach me at podcast@northofrapture.com. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram @northofrapture, all one word. Thanks for listening until next time. And now, if you'll excuse me, I need to return some videotapes.